Welcome to Liberty Media's Charm Offensive. I am your host, Tiffany Madison, and you can find this interview and more on my publishing site, tiffanymadison.liberty.me. Today I am talking to both Corey Iacono and Matt Palumbo. Corey is the co-author of In Defense of Classical Liberalism and a junior pharmaceutical science and economics major student at the University of Rhode Island. Matt Palumbo is author of Conscience of a Young Conservative and also the co-author of In Defense of Classical Liberalism. They are both also administrators of the very popular Facebook page, Being Classical Liberal. Welcome, Matt and Corey.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you guys. I'm a big fan of your page. As one of the few classical liberals in the liberty space that actually identifies with those economic principles, it's wonderful to actually get a chance to speak to you guys.
Just to you.
It's nice to talk to you too.
Cool. So I had the pleasure of reading quite a bit of your book, and I like that you start with the foundations that many misunderstand about classical liberalism. In your experience, either from writing this book or administrating this page, what are the most profound misconceptions of classical liberalism?
Do you want to start that, Corey, or should I cover it?
What?
Do you want to cover that question, or should I?
You got it.
All right. Well, I mean, some of the misconceptions I've gotten is that, I guess kind of from the left, that we're all anarchists, and from the ANCAPs that we're all statists. That's kind of the misconceptions I've gotten. I don't know if Corey wants to touch on that too.
Well, I think for me, the biggest misconception about classical liberalism that we get a lot on BCL, Being Classical Liberal, the Facebook page, is that a lot of people conflate classical liberalism with modern-day contemporary liberalism. And obviously, like, we all know that it's not the same thing. A lot of people don't know that. And classical liberalism is basically, it's the principles that, like, modern-day libertarianism in the United States is founded upon. It's about free markets, limited government, individual rights, and whatnot. And so I would really love to proclaim the term liberalism, but, you know, it's too often conflated with contemporary liberalism, so we have to call it classical liberalism. And that's pretty much the biggest misconception that I've seen.
I've also encountered that as well when I speak to leftist liberals, is what I call them, that are pro-intervention, pro-taxes, pro-regulation. When I say that or identify as a classical liberal, that also always gives me an in, because we can find a common ground on things we agree with, which is often the more civil liberties side, and then that opens the floodgate to talk about economics. So yeah, it's definitely defining it as classical is very helpful. Immigration is a hot issue that you address in your book. One major point of contention for open borders or for freer movement of immigration is that lower-paid immigrants take American jobs. When researching the question of whether this is true, what fact or statistic surprised you most? Sorry.
That's fine. Well, Corey actually wrote that chapter, but I edited a lot of it. I think I was most surprised is we kind of divided American workers into like three categories: very low-skilled, moderately skilled, and very highly skilled. So we found that most immigrants are in the low-skilled or highly skilled category, while most Americans are kind of in the middle of the road in terms of skills. So they're not directly competing with most American workers. And then kind of there's a fallacy that there's only a fixed amount of jobs out there that can be distributed among the citizens, when obviously that's not how an economy works. There's, in a growing economy, there's more and more jobs every year, and immigration's also a positive for that. So.
Yeah, and personally, what I found to be quite surprising is that if you actually look up the research on the relationship between immigrants and wages, is that you find that immigrants, they do decrease wages typically for people with less than a high school degree, but only a very small fraction of the whole U.S. labor force has less than a high school degree. I think it's like less than 6%, and they boost wages for nearly every other like education category. Like everyone who has more than a high school degree, those who have an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, they all get gains from immigrants. And when you weigh out the costs and the benefits, most research finds that the net benefit, there's a net benefit for the average American, about a little less than around 0.5%. That immigrants typically boost the average American's wages by about 0.5%. And so the whole idea that immigrants drag down wages for native U.S. citizens it's true for some people, but it's totally outweighed by all the positives. So that's what I found most surprising.
Yeah, and I kind of noticed with conservatives, they kind of contradict themselves. Like they realize that even though if technology kills jobs in the short term, it's kind of good in the long term. Is we're getting more done with that. Yet when it's immigrants doing the work that technology could otherwise do, they complain that it's killing jobs. So I mean, it's really the same thing between the two.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. Another point of concern for left liberals and feminists is the gender pay gap. I find it amusing that despite that President Obama has murdered countless young girls and women with his drone strike program abroad, he has positioned himself as a fighter for gender equality by passing the Lilly Ledbetter Act. What do you guys feel about that and its impact on wages in the economy? And do women get paid less for the same amount of work?
I mean, the key distinction is the same amount of work statement. I mean, do women make less than men? The answer is yes. The way this wage gap statistic is calculated is I think it's the average salary of all full-time female employees is divided into that of all full-time men employees. That's kind of where we get the number, but there's no adjustments done. So just as men and women are working full-time when we're comparing those groups doesn't mean they're working the same amount of hours. I think I was like the average man who works full-time works something like 8.15 hours a day, while the average woman works 7 point something. And what I found was that kind of explains like 25% of the wage gap. And then in the book, I dived a lot into different educational differences. While there are more female college grads, the kind of majors they choose pay a lot less than majors men choose. And those are the two big reasons that I found. And I think Corey can elaborate some other reasons that we looked at.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Men go into STEM jobs like engineering, mathematics, way more than women do. That's why they typically earn more. Obviously, they don't earn the same jobs. Men mostly go into dangerous jobs, which have a wage premium. Because more dangerous jobs are going to pay more to attract workers. Also, there was when we really dig into these differences between the career choices of men and women, a U.S. Department of Labor, they commissioned a study to see if the gender wage gap really does exist. And what the authors did was they took into account like work experience, I mean not work experience, occupation, how long they work, marital status, and stuff along those lines. And what they found was when you take into those things, the wage gap is around 5%. And then they listed several other things that they couldn't take into account, but they wish they did. And their ultimate conclusion was that the gender wage gap almost certainly is only a result of individual choices between men and women. I also saw another study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they found that men and women in the same occupation with similar family roles, there was no wage gap, except there was one in favor of women, but it was statistically insignificant. So there's tons of studies on this, and when you take into account like marital status and occupation, the hours worked, education, when you take these things into account, the wage gap either shrinks to being meaningless or it just isn't there.
Warren Farrell wrote a book called Why Men Earn More, and he kind of touched on one of the points you made, that if you compare men and women with the same family or same family roles, the incomes are pretty similar. I think he actually found that women who with the same family roles as men, I think it was like they earn 117% of what men earn if they're never married or never have children. So I think that might be the statistic you were mentioning.
Yeah, I come from the corporate world, and in my experience, I mean, I've worked with nothing but women managers. In every, whether they're the comptroller or the vice president, I think that the gender pay gap sentiments are a throwback from previous generations that really don't have much of a place in the modern era, especially in the millennial generation. I mean, now more women than ever are getting their college degrees and advancing upwards, through academia, of more in some cases than men. Is that true?
Oh, and that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Men are, I think it's about 60% of college graduates now are women. There's a lot more college graduates among women now than there are men. And the wage gap has been declining over time pretty rapidly. And so in the future, maybe in like 2 decades or so, we actually might see that men or women on average are making more than a man does. So that could be
I think that's very interesting. I talked to my mother about these things, and she's a baby boomer, and just a couple of generations ago, women couldn't own property. So you kind of have to give you have to give society an opportunity to catch up when you give liberty and equality to what was formerly a very strictly patriarchal society. Moving on, so Franklin D. Roosevelt is often exalted as the hero of the working class, an icon of liberalism. You address this misconception in your book. I apologize I didn't get an opportunity to finish it. And if so, what misconceptions do you find most the FDR admirers harbor?
Everything. Did you cover that topic, or was it me who did the FDR's?
I don't think I did first.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I don't even remember. Misconception. I mean, the two main misconceptions is kind of like the left. The misconception that the left has about him is that the New Deal was what got us out of the Great Depression. But on the right, they kind of have a similar myth that it was World War II that got us out of the Depression. So it's like they kind of want militarized Keynesianism. And I think Emma Corr sent me a study the other day that it was expansionary monetary policy that played the largest role in getting us out of the Depression. So it wouldn't be the New Deal or World War II.
Oh yeah, that's totally true. I was actually looking into this on with some research by Keynesian economist Christina Romer has actually done a lot of research into this, and as we know, Milton Friedman did research into this. And basically what they come to conclusion is that coming off the gold standard and expansionary monetary policy is what brought us out of the Depression. I know some Austrians may not like this, but this is what like the monetarist Keynesian explanation of how the Great Depression ended. And neither of those explanations, either Keynesian or monetarist, from their research, show that fiscal policy had any significant role in it. Because Christina Romer, her paper says that all the fiscal policies engaged in by the FDR administration, that they were just too small to have an impact. And yeah, as you said, people think that FDR is like the savior of the working class, but to be honest, I don't buy that. Like some of the laws that he did, like promoting unions or minimum wage laws, that's stuff that left wingers like love. But like when you take an analytical perspective on this, you have to recognize that both unions and minimum wage laws, they're great for some people, but they also they have some pretty negative effects on employment, especially unions. And minimum wage laws, they're not huge deals. Like they're not going to throw the economy into a spiral, but they're still not good things to have.
I know a lot of liberals, they'll argue that if the minimum wage isn't supposed to be a living wage, then why did FDR, who signed it into law, say it should be a living wage? And they kind of neglect that when FDR signed the minimum wage, it was worth what $4 is worth today, which is almost half of what our minimum wage is. So.
Yeah, and in regards to the minimum wage, a lot of just one myth that me and Matt commonly see is that the minimum wage used to be around $10 an hour when you adjust for inflation, around 1960 or whatever. And the thing is, no serious economist uses the consumer price index anymore as a measure of inflation because they all recognize that it overstates it. And so what the Federal Reserve uses, their preference is the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures. And when you use that measure of inflation, the minimum wage, the highest it's ever been in the United States, was around $8 an hour. And so that kind of throws out that talking point.
Yeah, plus whenever we see that stat, is the minimum wage high by historical standards, let's say in 1960, whatever, it was $10, they're always cherry picking the highest year where it was the highest. And acting like that was the norm when it was just that high for a year. So
what do you think the consequences will be for places like Seattle that have hiked their minimum wage up to $15 an hour, besides obviously automation of these kind of menial jobs? What do you think the long-term consequences will be? Well,
luckily for Seattle, their cost of living is so high that when you adjust for the cost of living, the minimum wage won't be literally worth $15. Maybe it'll be 10 or 12. It's not to say one of consequences. I think one effect that could happen is people who live in lower cost areas, but maybe near the city, will apply for jobs in the city. So there might be a displacement where it's people not actually from Seattle that are high skilled are taking the jobs that were meant to be going to Seattle workers. And then obviously, you'll see increases in youth unemployment. The youth labor force participation rate will probably shrink because they're not going to be able to find jobs. They're going to give up. And those are probably the big reasons, or the big things that we're going to see happen.
Yeah, and the big problem with the $15 minimum wage is we've never seen like something like that. It's most likely get like it even makes you know economists who support minimum wage increases. It even like makes them hesitant to support that. Like for example, Aaron Dubay, I think he's from University of Massachusetts. He's a economist who has endorsed raising the minimum wage to around $10 an hour, but he's expressed some doubt about the $15 an hour because at some point raising like more than doubling the minimum wage or almost doubling it, that's a pretty big deal. We don't know what's going to happen, but that could be like raising it to $15 an hour. That could have some pretty devastating effects on youth unemployment, low skilled unemployment. Raising it $1 or $2 isn't going to be a big deal, but it will have some negative effects. And yeah,
Maybe we could maybe we could touch on Australia, because people will cite that as a place with like a $16 minimum wage and not of any consequences.
Yeah, they also cite that when they discuss gun control too. That they surrendered all the firearms and now they live in this virtual utopia.
I think Craig actually knows a lot about the gun politics in Australia, so we can touch on that. But in regards to the minimum wage, when you look at the cost of living, I think it's like their $16 minimum wage is worth like $10.70. And the way the minimum wage works, it's different from ours. Like theirs, it's graduated by age. So like if you're like 16, you earn 7 something. When you hit 17, you earn 8 something, and it goes up to the 16 once you hit 21. Additionally, I mean, they obviously realize in Australia that it does cause job losses because if you're disabled, you're not eligible for that minimum wage. So if you're above 21 and let's say you're quote unquote 50% disabled, whatever the government deems that to be, you only get 50% of the minimum wage. So they obviously realize if they had to get paid the full minimum wage, they wouldn't be employed. So, yeah.
And speaking of the gun control in Australia, like the thing is, like there's so many studies that have covered this, and there are some studies that say the gun control worked, and there are other studies that say it didn't. The thing is, you have to use controls. You have to have a control like sample or a control country to compare it to. And the thing is that New Zealand didn't embark on this gun control legislation that Australia did. And what the talking point is that Australia had a mass shooting, then they banned guns, and they haven't had a mass shooting since.
They
But
actually had one last week.
New Zealand hasn't banned the guns that Australia has, and they haven't had a mass shooting since 1996 either.
Yeah, it's very biased. It's a very passionate subject for me, and I always like to point out, just as you did, that the data is very skewed. There's a lot of political bias that goes into these studies that are often conducted, and it is very, very skewed. Go ahead, Matt.
I mean, even if, let's say, gun control did work there, I mean, they have the advantage of being an island, so it's not as easy to smuggle guns in, while if we, let's say, ban all guns, they could come from Canada, Mexico, there's a lot more ways guns could come in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of differences, too. I mean, they don't have the interstate population issues
right.
that we do as well. They don't have a totally different demographic situation. I had a couple of American friends, one from Texas and one from California, that spent quite a bit of time out there. And the whole attitude is different. There's very, laissez-faire type of attitude, kind of, we'll do it tomorrow, hanging back, cool, man, very, very laid back. And they feel more comfortable without those firearms because, again, they have very controlled immigration. There's not illegal arms coming in as much as there are, in the United States and elsewhere. And again, I always like to point out that we have 315 plus million people in this country, and our violent crime rate has continued to plummet and will continue to plummet. What are we at, like a 40-year low now? And
it's very low.
And firearm usage is through the roof, and that's just what's on the books. I have all of my acquaintances and friends have arsenals that no one has on the books anywhere. So what the actual statistics that they have are nowhere near what is actually out there. They put 210 or so, the UN estimated 210 million firearms in the possession of American households. And
it's definitely a lot more than that.
Double that.
Yeah.
That's just registrations. And I've never lived in a state that has required, out of all 4 states I've lived in, that has ever required a registration, and I haven't carry. So yeah, it's significantly higher. So I have a final question for you guys.
Sure.
We anarcho-capitalists argue that the fatal error of classical liberals lies in failing to realize that the theories are impossible because they're dependent on the minimal state, which they see, as institutional coercion in all forms. So since the goal of classical liberalism is limiting the power of the state while also deeming it necessary, anarcho-capitalists argue that the principles of classical liberalism are outdated because the 21st century has demonstrated that the state is unnecessary, that statism, even if minimal and restricted, is theoretically impossible, and that given human nature, once a state exists, it's impossible to limit its power. What do you say to these critics?
Think how to formulate that. I mean, I don't know if you could say that just because we acknowledge big government's bad, that small government can be good. It's like saying like a glass of wine after dinner can't be healthy because if you have 10, you'll be drunk. I don't know. I don't really get the logic behind that kind of argument. I mean, you could put constitutional amendments through to limit government spending each year, or there are ways you can keep that in check. I guess government to obey that would be a challenge. But.
Yeah. In my opinion, sure, government does grow over time. It does seem that that's the case. But, the way that you set up a government, like the way that the United States government was set up, our government has grown a lot smaller, or a lot more slowly than countries in like Europe because of the way their governments are set up. And also, for me, like as classical liberalism, I don't strive towards, I don't want to say this ideal is it. I want to say, actually, I do want to say, like, the ideal state is one that's small, but I do acknowledge that ideals are never going to happen. Yeah. I just think we should strive towards it. Like, I think that, making government smaller is a good idea. Do I think that we're ever going to get a government that's, that did the same amount of things as it did back in, the 19th century? No, I don't. But, like, even if that's obviously never going to happen, but it's worth striving towards. Also, if anarcho-capitalists are right, I mean, which I think they are, that, the ideal classical liberal state is never going to, like, stay, like, the same size as we want it to. Like, they have to argue that
anarchy will be there forever.
Anarchy is better than, a growing government, or that, governments won't emerge from anarchy. Like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like anarchy is like something that will stay. If it's, the natural way of things for governments to grow, then we would expect it to grow under anarchy as well, for people to form governments. Like, I don't know, I just don't find the argument particularly convincing.
It's like a slippery slope argument, basically.
Yeah, it's also, you have to argue that anarchy is better than, big government or small government, in my opinion. It seems that most anarchists are anarchists because of their moral absolutism more than anything else. But not that I'm one to judge, like that's someone's philosophy. I personally don't agree to it. I'm more of a utilitarian. So, in my opinion, yeah, I don't think the classical liberal state will ever exist, but I think it's worth working towards.
Yeah, I mean,
anarchists point to the. Oh, sorry, Matt. Were you going to say something? Go ahead.
Nah, don't worry about it. It's fine.
So many anarchists point to the idea of the actual Constitution and all of its flaws, and they look at that as the actual outline for what not to do. Is there any, obviously the federal government is not a viable institution in the course of the next couple hundred years with inflation and the devaluation of the dollar and all the other individual problems that are likely to emerge, which will discredit it as a federal institution governing over all of these states and regions and various different diverse populations. If the federal government were supposedly to collapse in the next century or so, and there were to be several different little federations and styles of governments or non-governments to establish themselves in the various regions of the United States, starting a Constitution 2.0 or a Constitution 3.0 isn't necessarily a bad thing for some thinkers, because not everyone agrees with the total belief that everyone can adhere to the non-aggression principle, or that private law can take care of every private legal issue, because not every jurisdiction and regional power would agree to this private law and the courts and all this justice system that would be privatized. Do you think that something like that is the answer to what the Constitution has in its flawed state currently now, which failed to restrain the growth of government power? Or is there another ideal that classical liberals envision?
I mean, I think what most classical, I think their approach to politics is kind of working within the system. So I guess passing legislation to try to limit government. And I think most classical liberals take that approach. So I don't really know how to answer that question. I'm sorry.
That was a creative question.
Right. So would you mind like rephrasing that?
Yeah, I was a little confused. I'm sorry.
Well, I kind of tied in some, let's assume that the federal government in the next century were to collapse. What would replace it in the classical liberal ideal? Would you have various little federations of different governments? And if so, if one of those, occurred and one of them, established itself in the classical liberal ideal, what would that look like? Is it the night watchman state? Is it a constitution 2.0? What does the classical liberal ideal state look like?
I guess probably more of the Constitution 2.0. I think what we learned from the Articles of Confederation is that you need some sort of federal government to kind of hold unity among the different federations, but like a system of federalism is what I would want, but with more restrictions on what government can do than our current Constitution. Like maybe some restrictions on what spending can be as a percent of GDP, what kind of things they can and cannot do. Like most of the growth in government we've seen in recent times is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those sort of programs, so we could try to put limits on those. I guess that'd be good.
Yeah, I think if you ask, like, you'll probably get, a million different answers from a million different people, I suppose. But I would largely agree with Matt. A federalist system, constitutional system, it seems like great from, like, and I know a lot of anarchists don't like that, but I think that our system, our government, has, the way our government is set up, has allowed us to restrain the size of government more so than, countries in Europe have. And I think that's a good part of it. Even if government growth is going to be inevitable, I think it's going to be inevitable under any system. As I've said before, even under anarchy, people are going to set up government. That's just how it is, and they're going to grow. I don't think that there is any anarchy utopia. I certainly I wish anarcho-capitalism was a viable option, because it is to my philosophy perfectly. But I'm not a moral, I don't base, I don't know, I don't think it's realistic, personally. And even under anarchy, as I've said, governments would likely emerge.
Yeah, fair enough. One last question. So out of all of the research that you conducted, what surprised you most about the data and the information that you uncovered?
I have to flip the book a little bit first. I think it was one piece on inequality, actually, that we were looking at. We found that more inequality correlates with more per capita income growth, I think it was, or GDP growth in rich countries, but it's the opposite in poor countries. And our explanation was that in rich countries, inequality is usually arisen from wealth creation. So, I mean, those at the top are disproportionately benefiting, but everyone else is better off. While in poorer countries, it's usually rent-seeking that's creating wealth for those at the top, and it's at the expense of everyone else and not creating any new wealth in the process.
Yeah, I think Matt's totally right on that. We looked into some research on this, and there was research to back that up, that poor countries are generally more corrupt, and that corruption led to both poverty and inequality. And so our hypothesis was that corruption in third world countries led to inequality, which then led to slow economic growth. And we see all these lefties, they like to cite papers from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, which say that income inequality is bad for economic growth. But these, as Scott Winship of the Brookings Institution pointed out, these papers generally look at poor countries, developing countries, and as Matt just pointed out, when we differentiate between rich countries and poor countries and developing countries, income inequality is not good for them, according to the research. But in rich countries like the United States or in Europe, income inequality is positively correlated with economic growth. So, there should be no claim, there is no legitimate claim that, income inequality is going to harm growth in the United States.
Interesting. Well, cool. I'm looking forward to finishing your book. I appreciate you guys giving me the advance copy. It's very good. I have nice talking points now when I debate status, so I appreciate that.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me, Corey and Matt. For those interested in the defense of classical liberalism, please see the notes in this video that link to Amazon. Please also support their Facebook page, Being Classical Liberal, Being Classically Liberal, And if you enjoyed this interview, please share the word, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.